right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time to join today. We're really excited about this session with our partners at Ideas 42. Yashna, you can go to the next slide and the next slide after that. Today's session is 120 minutes. We might end a little earlier than that, just based on how long it takes to run through content and the engagement. We do ask that we keep ourselves on mute because we're recording the session to just minimize background noise. And we'll take a short break somewhere around the 2 o'clock mark, but please take care of yourself, do what you need throughout the session. Next slide, please. And with that, I'll turn it over to Yashna to get us started.
Thank you, Hiba. Hi, everyone. My name is Yashna, and I am a senior behavioral designer at Ideas 42. As Hiba mentioned, we are partnering with the EVC to run a series of workshops. We're very excited to be here with you today. So I'll be guiding us through our effective survey design workshop with the help of my colleague, Vivien, who's also on the line with us today. So Hiba will share a handout summarizing the content that we'll be going over today in the chat. But to quickly get everyone oriented today, we'll start by touching on how to effectively write survey questions. Then we're going to talk a little bit about how to structure your survey to make the most out of it. We'll then have a little maybe discussion where we'll together review and recommend suggestions to a sample survey. We'll have a little bit of a break halfway through the session, and then we'll dive into dissemination strategies before finally wrapping up with a last breakout group where we'll share dissemination strategies that we've all used in the past and or are planning to use in the future. So surveys are useful tools for almost any effort or organization. They help us make strategic decisions, they make programs and services more effective. And surveys are important because they can help organizations gauge how community members perceive them, how they've come to learn of their services, and whether the services provided are helpful. So no matter what you're using surveys for, it can often be hard to get actionable information from them. On the one hand, some questions that we tend to ask don't give us information that is actionable. So satisfaction questions, for example, like the one shown on the left on this slide, are good for funders, for instance, and for getting a very high level sense of how folks feel about your services. But this information at the end of the day isn't very actionable. Another thing that can get in the way of being able to act on survey results is if you don't get many answers. In this graph to the right, we see that the number of people who didn't respond to the survey is quite large, and their participation might have swayed the trends that we observe in any direction, making it hard to feel confident about any kind of insights that we can derive from this graph. So today we'll be talking about strategies and best practices to help improve your survey results, both maximizing the value of responses so that you can make changes based off of them, and maximizing response rates so you have enough answers to feel confident in the information that you've collected. As with any communication, an important first step to designing an effective survey is designing your goals and audience. Defining, sorry, your goals and audience. So here are some examples of survey goals. So you can, for example, decide to develop a survey in order to inform decisions about next year's services, or because you're interested in understanding how respondents learned about an organization, or because you need to gather data for a funder. Once you have answers to those questions and your goals are clear, you're ready to start writing your questions. So within this section, we're going to go over some best practices that support the writing of effective survey questions. We'll touch on the importance of reducing hassles, or basically making things as easy as possible for the respondents. And then we'll talk about choosing the right question format for your goals. And finally, we'll discuss how it's important to ensure that the questions provide you with actionable information tied to your goals. So to work with concrete examples of how to do this, we'll go through two types of questions that all organizations are probably interested in at some point or the other. So one is satisfaction questions, and then the other is questions to assess interest in potential new products or services. So diving into our first best practice, one insight you're going to want to keep in mind as you're creating your survey is that hassles or seemingly small inconveniences impact people's behavior. For example, needing to find a stamp can lead to someone not mailing important information. Seeing that you need to wait in line could mean you give up on participating in something or in accessing the resource that everyone else is waiting in line for. And even online, the hassle of needing to remember a password or set up an account can lead to people dropping off. So hassles like this are also relevant when it comes to survey responses. For example, if you ask people for a specific piece of information that they wouldn't easily have off the top of their head, like the date maybe on which they attended a workshop many months ago, the hassle of trying to remember or find that piece of information can definitely lead to people dropping off. The first way to avoid creating hassles in your surveys is to write questions that are easy to understand and answer. You want to eliminate opportunities for people to drop off or skip a question because they're not sure how to answer. So the first strategy is pretty straightforward. You want to make sure you're asking one question at a time. This sounds obvious, but it's not hard to slip into asking two questions at once, especially when you're trying to be expansive or encompass lots of different possibilities in your questions. So this slide shows an example where we're asking, how would you rate your experience as a volunteer and the ease of signing up to be a volunteer? Someone might think their experience as a volunteer was great, but signing up was frustrating, making it really hard for them to know how to answer and also muddying the data that you'll be collecting on the other side. The second strategy is to simplify any language you use and remove jargon. As an example, we worked with an organization that asked the following question and initially provided these responses. The problem with these options, like employment readiness services, is that they're not meaningful on their own to most people. Even remote training opportunities is unclear. Are they trainings about working remotely, or are they remote trainings about other skills, for example? And here's how they rewrote these response options in a clearer, more specific, and simpler way. While these aren't exactly the same options, the revision highlights the most appealing services in language that is very clear and easy to understand to respondents. As you're writing your questions, you'll also be deciding whether to ask questions as closed or open-ended questions. So a closed-ended question is one where respondents select an answer from a predetermined set of options, whereas an open-ended question are ones where respondents can get to write their own responses and freely put in any text that they would like to share with us. So there are pros and cons to each of these. So for example, with closed-ended questions, it's easier for respondents to answer, it's easier to aggregate and analyze responses, and it's also easier to limit respondents to thinking about a few distinct options that are relevant to you. For open-ended questions, it is more work to answer, so respondents may drop off or choose to skip these because it's hard to answer. You can collect more detail, however, on how respondents are feeling or any kind of important information that they want to share with you, and you can learn about new perspectives, challenges, needs, or experiences. We often try to design our surveys so that they are mostly closed-ended questions that are easy to answer, adding in open-ended questions where we want more detail or where we don't want to constrain people's thinking to some options. And when relevant, we can also consider adding open-ended questions at the end of surveys that mostly consist of closed-ended questions, so that if it do lead to drop-offs, these are happening towards the end of a survey when we have already collected a lot of the information that we need. Now, shifting gears and turning to our third best practice, which is to ensure that we are developing questions that serve our goals, we'll begin with the example of satisfaction questions, which are a common practice. So satisfaction questions are great for collecting data to demonstrate your organization's value to funders and partners, and for assessing client satisfaction from clients who you know have used certain of your services. But they won't help you improve a program or service. To get information that will help you improve a program or service, you'll want to ask questions about specific experiences, needs, or interests. So for example, you could ask what program or service the respondent has used in the past over a certain period of time. And you can ask what they found valuable about the service or whether they have any suggestions for how to improve the service. You can also ask them about which of the following issues they have faced in the past while using your program or service so that you can get a better sense of where you need to invest resources and improve your services. One example of how we've done this, so in surveys sent after our workshops, we ask whether people will be able to use strategies from the session and when. We also ask for specific examples because we want to understand what people are taking away from the workshop. We ask these questions because our goal really isn't just to have people appreciate or enjoy the workshop, which we certainly hope you guys do, but also to ensure that they're able to use and apply what they learned. If not, I think we probably need to rethink our content a little bit. Now that we've touched on satisfaction questions, let's turn to questions like this one about interest. So again, there are benefits to asking these questions. They can help you with assessing client interest in potential or current services, and they can also help you with determining how you want to allocate your resources. But they certainly won't help you estimate future participation or usage or understand what features of a topic respondents think would be useful. Well, this question, as we went through it earlier, like the biggest problem is the lack of responses. Even when you look at the people who did respond, just knowing that folks think these services would be helpful isn't enough information for you to know whether they would use or benefit from the service. It also doesn't help you understand what features of a topic respondents think would be useful. So we're really here missing out on an opportunity we have to inform how to design a program for it to be the most effective it can be. So let's start by talking about why asking about interest isn't enough to know whether people will engage with or use an offering. So assuming its intention translates into action is a typical assumption of human behavior, but it's not really true. Behavioral science and our own experiences have shown that there are all kinds of reasons people might form an intention to do something but never really follow through. The context that the person is operating in interacts with the intention that they have formed, and that interaction may very often result in inaction. For instance, there could be difficulty or distraction involved, the timing might not be right, or it might just not be clear how the action can be completed, and all of these can lead to inaction. And that ends up creating what we call in behavioral science an intention action gap. Coming back to our survey question, if you just ask people about whether they're interested in a topic or service, you might get a lot of people saying yes, but that doesn't mean that they will actually engage with it or use it once you roll it out. To get a sense of that, you can go about it in two ways. So the first way, you can give people as much information as you can on the program based on the elements of it that are fixed and then ask them if they are interested. For example, let's say that we're hosting workshops and they absolutely need to be English because our staff only speaks English. So you can add that piece of information to the description of a program before asking people if they would be interested. And the second way you can gauge that interest is that you can get them to share their input about elements that are adaptable, such as when the workshops should be held for better engagement. These are all things that could affect whether someone shows up or uses something that have nothing to do really with just the interest that they have in the service you're providing. And the good news is that a lot of these things are within our control. So if you know people are available at certain times, you can plan around that so that more people who are interested can actually show up. So going back to this type of question that doesn't really help you understand what features of a topic respondents think would be useful, let's dive into a short group of activity. So we have people interested in financial counseling, which is a one-on-one service where a counselor sits down with a person, reviews their financial situation, and then provides advice on what the person can do to manage their finances and debt in a way that allows them to really reach their goals. So we're sitting down to design our financial counseling service, but we're feeling a bit stuck. So what other information do you think you would need to go ahead and design such a program? What kind of questions would you want to ask, for example? You can feel free to unmute and share, or just go ahead and send some thoughts through the chat as well.
This is Stacy with CHC. I guess I would want to know a little bit more about what their experience already is, and then also understand what they are looking for out of the course, because financial counseling could mean pretty much anything. So I'd want to better understand what exactly that means to them, to be able to design the course.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Maybe also that kind of information can help you also market the offering to people and know what it is that you want to emphasize as you're sharing like content about the program. Any other thoughts? Great. If we don't have other thoughts, I will move us on to just kind of like wrap up this final section. So basically, like we went through a number of best practices that I just wanted to summarize here. So first, as you're writing your questions, make sure that your questions are easy to understand and answer. Use open-ended questions to collect more detailed or nuanced responses. Use close-ended questions to reduce your respondents' effort and make your data analysis more straightforward. Ask about specific experiences, needs, or interests to collect information that will help you improve an offering. And finally, ask about details that could affect take-up beyond just interest to make sure that you're understanding whether people will really use an offering, and so that you can also gather information that helps you design your offerings better. So we've talked a lot about how to write individual questions, but there are other important pieces of survey design to think about, specifically around, yes?
Yes, no, since this is such a small group, does anybody have questions about anything up until this point?
I think you guys are doing a great job. I'm just soaking it in.
Love to
Well,
hear.
feel free to interrupt, be it via chat or verbally, because yeah, this is a small group, so our breakout activities are not going to exist, or we'll do it in a large group. So
Yeah. And also, Vivien, I'm not able to keep tabs on the chat, but if there's anything that's like coming up, like feel free to interrupt.
I'll jump in.
All right, so let's dive now into structuring your survey. So here's a structure that we usually recommend adopting for a survey. So we'll dive into each of them in a bit more detail. The first block is the introduction, and we recommend every survey include a description of a survey purpose, duration, deadline, and how the data will be used, and whether also and how much respondents will be compensated if it is a paid opportunity. So this survey intro does a good job of having all four of these, five rather, of these considerations. Here we include the survey duration, we include the survey purpose, how the data will be used, the deadline for filling out the survey, as well as the compensation. After the introduction, you may want to have some screening questions. The idea with screening questions is that sometimes people outside of your target audience will get a hold of your survey, but you don't need their answers. If you're paying people for the survey and people who you don't want responses from are actually filling out the survey, you end up spending your budget on responses that you don't need. And even if you're not paying, it's still extra work because you have to filter for the responses that you truly need ultimately. And of course, on the other side, people might be choosing to spend some of their time on your survey thinking that it will be helpful when they are in fact doing unnecessary work. Demographic questions are typically used in surveys to help you understand who is answering your survey, and can include questions about age, race, marital status, or location. And sometimes these are used as screening questions. So you should primarily ask respondents these questions at the end of a survey, which we'll talk about in a little bit, except in cases where you feel like it's really important to use them upfront because you're screening for a very specific type of respondents. For example, in one of our projects, we didn't need responses from people making over 70K. So we use the screening question on this slide as the first question in our survey. Next is the body, which will have your survey's main questions. Sometimes your survey will not have much beyond a body, and that's totally fine. But somehow, sometimes your survey is more than just a few questions. And in this case, we recommend you use headings to create sections. That helps organize your questions, and it helps participants orient themselves and can also give them a sense of progress as they go through. Once you've asked your main questions, you'll want to ask any sensitive or demographic questions. So let's dive a bit more into what sensitive and demographic questions are, how they affect responses, when it is worth including these questions, and how to include these questions. So there's no one set of questions that are considered sensitive because they differ based on context, really. So it's more useful to think of categories of questions that are sensitive. And these are questions that can be about personal information, including demographic information. It can be about stigmatized or controversial topics. It can be about socially undesirable behaviors, or it can be information respondents fear could be used against them. Some examples here, just like to make it concrete, are how much debt do you have? Are you a citizen? Did you vote in the last election? So demographic questions help you understand who is answering your survey. And as we mentioned earlier, sometimes demographic questions.
No, sorry for being a little late.
Oh, no worries at all. Welcome. So as we mentioned earlier, sometimes demographic questions are used as screening questions. For example, if you only need responses from people who work or live in certain neighborhoods, or people who fall within a certain citizenship category, let's say. So if you're considering doing this, it's important to first consider whether the demographic question is sensitive, and second, to weigh the advantages of screening against the disadvantages of asking these questions too early or at all. So what are the disadvantages? So asking these questions at all, and especially too soon, can affect responses in two ways. First, it can lead to more drop-off or prefer not to respond answers. So a big reason why this happens is because it puts people on guard. In some cases, people will decide they're not going to fill out your survey because they prefer to avoid giving out information about themselves or a bit suspicious of you, really. Or they'll still fill things out, but will answer things with prefer not to respond because they do not feel comfortable sharing that sensitive information yet. However, it can also change the nature of people's responses. So if you hadn't asked this question, basically, they could have responded differently. This is because asking people about their identity can affect their behavior and preferences. And this in behavioral science is called identity priming. So for example, asking about gender upfront could affect subsequent answers from business owners who are women and make them more likely to say that they're interested in a security consultation, for example, than if they weren't primed with their identity upfront. Because of the impact these questions can have on responses and on respondents' well-being, we recommend being critical about whether it's worth including them at all when you're developing your surveys. But there are certainly reasons to include them. And the main two reasons should be asking these questions are needed information for funding purposes, or the information will meaningfully influence your programs and services. For example, you might want to understand how groups' needs or experiences differ from each other as you cater to different groups. In this case, sensitive and demographic information could help you shape the program with tailored services to a target population. Just as a concrete example, for example, knowing that you have a meaningful community of people who are not citizens could lead you to develop more services specifically for them.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please go for it.
I was wondering because I am into data and all things ethically gathering, I can't speak words, ethically gathering.
Yes.
And do you guys have any insight into the best way to sort of communicate that to your audience, that you aren't asking to probe, you're just asking to make sure everybody has the right sort of representation within the results?
Yeah. I think it's always we'll touch on that in a little bit, but I think it's always really helpful to provide context about why you're gathering this information. So it's helpful to make sure that as you're asking the questions that could feel a bit more sensitive, you're really kind of sharing a little blurb perhaps to say that we're asking this question because it's going to influence program design and whatnot in a certain way, so that clients have a context basically for why you're asking them. And then I think one other thing is also to think about, as we've been saying, when you put it towards the end of a survey as well, you have a bit of more time to build trust with the respondent. So they might maybe as you're asking about their opinions on how you can improve your design, this kind of I think conversation or feedback seeking exercise we've seen is actually something that people really appreciate. They love feeling that they're being heard, that they're having a chance to contribute to the products that they're using. So I think just the type of questions sometimes that you're asking in your surveys might be helping with building trust. And towards the end, you might just kind of in addition to having had some time with the respondent, you might have share the information that has built trust, and that helps them feel more comfortable towards the end. And then also like some like additional things you can do like in your introduction of a survey is share a bit about how you're going to like save the data, how it's going to be anonymous. You can talk about how like, you know, like we often like when we're like interviewing people, we'll tell them that we'll never reach out again, you know, like this is really like our only interaction that we're going to have with them. Like it's not like if they respond in a certain way, there's going to be repercussion and follow-ups and whatnot. So you can like build out like I think context within the introduction of a survey as well, like that will help people feel more comfortable.
And one thing that there's also a little bit of like, I found sometimes there's like a little bit of fear about explaining what some data is for. And this is especially around folks who work with immigrant populations where it's like, I am going to be providing this to a funder, and I know people are going to be worried if I tell them I'm going to be providing this to like an external source. But at least in the work we've done with like folks who are working with those communities, there's actually like, I mean, I assume we can all sort of relate to this, that like I prefer to know and understand, okay, I'm providing this to you because you need this kind of data to continue to get funding to support, to continue to offer the services. So I would approach it also from like a transparency sort of lens of this is why we're asking for it. It's just internal, or like we're going to be providing this to our funder, but it won't be, but like it helps us continue to support the work. So like providing those details actually helps people sort of feel a sense of agency of like, I understand why I'm providing this information and what it's going to do for the organization I'm providing it to.
Stacey, do you have a question as well?
I do. So I guess along those lines, I also wonder, how do you balance between putting in the contextual detail and giving enough for them to feel comfortable and building that sort of rapport and trustworthiness with the length of the survey? Because I know that the more context you provide, the longer the survey is going to be. And some folks will drop off just based off of the sheer length. And if there isn't necessarily what they feel to be an adequate either return on investment or some kind of compensation for completion of the survey, like how do you find that balance to be able to get the information you need without throwing the kitchen at them?
Yeah. I guess like two strategies come to mind. One is just kind of like maybe doing a bit of prioritization around like what kind of questions really need context. You know, like if some questions are just more straightforward, then like maybe you don't have to provide as much context. You can also, I think, like instead of like just kind of like having context throughout the survey, you can like either include it in the introduction and it just covers like, you know, the whole survey, or you could also just kind of like maybe group questions, you know, and then like instead of like having like context around each question, if there's like an easy way for you to have these groupings, maybe each section has a bit of a context on like why you're asking these questions. And again, if some sections are just like very straightforward, not sensitive, maybe they just don't come with any kind of context. But definitely it's an important thing to keep in mind.
Another piece that can help with that, or another thing that like I've often sort of worked with folks on, is really narrowing in on like why, like what am I going to do with information from this question? Because sometimes if you start to like really probe into that, you start to realize like, actually, I'm not sure what I would do. This is like useful information, but I don't know what I would do with it. Like I can't act on it. And then those you can start to like simplify or remove to shorten the survey. And the other thing, and this is just sort of related, it's not directly what you asked, Stacey, but sometimes we'll see surveys get a little complicated because you're asking questions that like a funder wants to know, or like that, you know, government agencies that you're working with like are asking you for specific information. And it like makes the survey more complicated because like sort of clients aren't necessarily thinking in terms of funder lingo, and so they're not sure how to answer things, or they become more complicated. So sometimes even taking that step to translate, or like asking the simpler question to their clients, and then you're going ahead and translating it into census categories, right? Whatever it is that sort of your funders or government agencies need. That can also help simplify things because you're just asking the simple question, and then you're doing the translating into the sort of like funder speak.
Any other questions before we move on? All right. So, as we've kind of like touched on already, as you're kind of like thinking about including these sensitive questions, we recommend that you like make sure that you're building rapport and trust with respondents before asking them, and try to like include them at the end of a survey so that like we're trying to reduce the impact of identity priming on responses as much as possible. So when you do include any demographic or sensitive questions, we'd suggest doing a few things. But again, we've already kind of touched on a little bit, but explain why this information is important, reiterate information about confidentiality. So you can share what you will do with the information, who will and won't have access to the information. And you can also touch again on whether the survey is anonymous. And then like lastly, yeah, I guess we didn't like touch on this one, but you can offer a prefer not to respond, response option always when you're asking these sensitive questions, so that respondents always have the option of choosing that and like don't feel like it's either answer or drop off. So these are strategies to keep in mind. And then last but not least, once you've asked all the sensitive or demographic questions, you can have a section for additional thoughts, which is completely optional for clients to get to. One thing that we also quickly wanted to touch on is that you can also consider having a time allowing section in your survey. So here, for example, at the end of a survey, we said, I have 2 more questions for you. And this was a phone survey. So I have 2 more questions for you. So do you have a few more minutes to answer my last questions? Your answers will help us improve our program and services. And the client could respond like, client is open to answering a few more questions during this call, or they're open to answering a few more questions, but want like a different call to answer them. Or finally, the client just does not want to continue the survey. So this allows you to still collect responses to some additional questions in a way that is more empowering to respondents, since you're kind of like recognizing that their time is valuable and giving them a choice. Now, once you've built out a first draft of your survey based on the guidelines that you've shared so far, it's always good to do a final copy edit. And you'll want to go back to your survey questions and reduce how much information you ask for. The idea here is that the more questions you have, the more likely people are to drop off. And a few ways to do this is first to remove questions that don't directly relate to your survey goals. Make sure that you're removing questions that are duplicative. And then if needed, make a number of questions optional. You can make lower priority questions optional. You can make open-ended questions optional, since we know that they're harder to respond to and clients might not want to. Make questions that are harder to answer, like just because of like the themes that are being brought up, also optional. Basically, ensure that you're only including necessary survey questions. Here, we just wanted to share an example of how this plays out in the real world. So this is work that we did with an organization that had low response rates for a few of the questions in their intake form, including sexual orientation, transgender identity, and ethnicity that are highlighted here. So I'm wondering, like, do you guys have any thoughts on why there were low response rates for these questions based off of what we've talked about so far, or any other thoughts?
I wonder if it's a mix between understanding how to answer and or the wording, because while many folks are sort of, I hate the phrase get with the times, but we kind of are, we're all moving through this human experience together. There's an elder generation that maybe doesn't understand any of that, the wording there. And so I could see that being sort of a plummet for results.
Mhm. Yeah,
I
that's
was gonna
really
say, I also feel like there's a lack of trust. Again, because of the current environment. For the gender identity, sexual orientation aspect of it, but then also for ethnicity. I'll be honest, like I always try to determine like what am I supposed to write there? Like if you're having me give you my race, I don't know why I would also then give you my ethnicity. Is kind of where I tend to go when I read those types of surveys.
Yeah, these are all really great points. Anything else? Yeah, I think you guys like really hit the nail on the head. So like I think like sexual orientation and transgender identity are questions that here in the survey like were included like very early on, when there's like maybe like not like trust hasn't like had a chance to be built yet, and like there are definitely questions that can come with stigma, that can be complicated for people to answer. And then ethnicity, like again, like yeah, it can like it's hard to also like know very often. Like the distinction between race, ethnicity, nationality is fuzzy for a lot of people, and it also kind of like looks a bit like a divider of sorts in the middle of a survey. So we also hypothesize that like potentially people are like missing or not like actually like seeing the question even when they're going for the survey. So we ended up updating the survey based on like a bunch of best practices and like our thoughts on how it was previously structured. So first we included an introduction to answer key questions. Then we updated the ethnicity to say ethnicity/nationality to mirror how clients within this specific group were talking about their own identity. And then we moved the sensitive questions towards the end of a survey. And these changes led to increases in response rates across the board. So for sexual orientation, we went from 59% response rates to 80%. For transgender identity, we went from 43% to 80%. And for ethnicity, we went from 40% to 43%. I'm going to pause once again before we go into our breakout. Well, I guess like before we dive into like an example, like and ask if there are any questions there.
I have one question. Do you think that had you changed the ethnicity question to be a selection, that would have increased the response rate there as well?
Like a multiple choice question of sorts?
Yeah, so like similar, if you go back one slide.
Yeah.
So like all of the other questions have checkboxes for the most part. I mean, like primary language spoken is kind of a 1-for-1, right?
Yeah.
Other languages spoken would be a very clear one. But if, depending on where this form is being filled out, my question would be like, are you looking for US citizen? Like, I think like if you were to put, similar to how you have race as check marks, if you were to put, I know that I see a lot of them there, like Latino, non-Latino, in terms of like what is meant by ethnicity and nationality. If you think that you had gone that route, would you have gotten a higher response rate?
Yeah, potentially. Vivien, are you familiar with the?
Yeah, I was on this project. So this was a funny project. So yes, what was frustrating, this was actually one of the reasons I was saying, like, sometimes your funders might use like census categories that like don't make sense to you, like the clients don't think of themselves as. They have a broad enough set of clients where what they found was that some clients found the race categories really clear and found that quite easy to fill out and then wouldn't fill out ethnicity. But then other people, like they just like didn't, race and ethnicity was not a concept to them. Like they just sort of like would put in their country. And so this was sort of, we were trying in this specific case, because of the specific like sort of populations they were working with, we were kind of trying to solve for two separate problems in one survey, where some people felt like the race question was easy and then would leave ethnicity empty. Other people, like ethnicity and race didn't mean anything, like they just like didn't have answers and they would just decline. But if you asked them their nationality, they would give you a nationality, and then you could like backwards engineer, okay, if that's their nationality, then likely we can put them in as, and it was often the sort of North African Arab groups that were the ones that like identified as via a nationality. So they were, this organization was pretty confident that if they had someone's nationality, they could sort of backwards engineer it. But yeah, it was this, your instinct is correct that like, if you have a few categories, it's often just easier for people to do, to like fill out those categories. That's why race isn't actually a bunch of races. It's actually a few other categories. But in this specific case, they were solving for like a kind of two sets of problems at once.
Yeah, definitely. Like I said, when I saw that, I'm like, I have no idea what I would write there, because technically I answered that in the race category.
Yeah, so. Yeah. So you would put decline, probably.
Yeah.
And the other thing about this form that is a little unique is they were verbally, that there was like someone filling it out with a staff member there. So they could go like, I don't know what this question means. And the staff would look and see, okay, you filled out race, you can decline ethnicity, nationality. So they had a little bit of a cheat because they had people right there also to help.
Any other questions? All right. Okay, so now I guess we'll dive into a little bit of a discussion. How Vivien, would you like to lead this one?
Yes. So this was going to be a breakout group, but we are actually a great size for a breakout group. I'm gonna, in the chat, put in a link to a document, which is just a Google Doc, or I'm sorry, it's just a Word doc. And it's the survey that you can barely read on the screen. So this is a survey that an organization was using to sort of understand what services they were going to provide, and also like when and how to reach out to clients. Many of their clients were unhoused, so that's why they were especially particular about understanding when and how to reach out. And basically what we want to do together is sort of like discuss what do you see as like areas of opportunity, given some of the stuff Yashna has talked about today. What would you change? What would you sort of add? Stuff, given like your own experiences, how would you improve or modify this? Are you all able to open that link? Yes.
Yep, it just came through.
I can even share my screen and point at things.
Can you share, Vivien? I can share.
Okay. Obviously, you can look at your own screens if you do not want to look at mine. Share it in case it's helpful. So yeah, take a moment to read through this, and then I'll ask some questions. Does anybody need another 30 seconds to read? Just start to talk. And if you're still reading, ignore me, saying nothing of value. Okay. So what's standing out to you about this survey? I know it's slightly weirdly formatted because the yes and no is like in parentheses as opposed to or you can't like actually check things off because it's just bullets. But besides that, what's standing out to you?
I mean, if this is the survey in totality, it doesn't really tell me anything. It just starts asking me questions. Like there's no explanation as to why I'm being asked of these questions or what the information is going to be used for. And then also, I guess for me, it kind of depends on like what is the intended outcome for this, because what does the organization that's hosting the survey looking to do? Because if the important aspect of it is for them to identify what services would be helpful for folks, I almost think I would maybe start with that, because if you have drop-off rate, you would probably want to get that most important question answered first.
Yeah.
And then there's no demographic information on this.
Yeah. Yeah, and Karen's adding here, there's too many questions and there's no introduction, which is sort of what you were getting at, that people don't, it just like starts to ask questions.
I was also gonna say I'm not sure it engages in like why this information is necessary. Like what's its intended purpose? What's in it for me to give you my
Yeah.
3 minutes or 5 minutes? Like what value add is it for me to do that? If I was looking at it like what do you need? Why do I need to be the person that answers this? So connecting the person so that there's buy-in to doing it.
Yeah. And that's especially important, I think, for this one, because this is for new, like, potential clients who have no, like, once a client has seen value in your services, they're much easier to, it's much easier to be like, hey, could you do this for 3 minutes? Like, there's more of a relationship. But if it's new clients, I think that's especially important because they're like, I don't even know what you do. What benefit am I going to get? I don't have time. That's a big one.
Also, I feel like the wording of the questions could be slightly different. Just like the word you employed on March 15th, like is the idea behind that is, are they trying to determine whether or not the quarantine or shutdown impacted their work aspect of it? I feel like that could be explained a bit better. And then I feel like I would want, like, were you employed on or before March 15th? Like March 15th is very specific. Like folks were impacted prior to March 15th for COVID resource, for reasons related to COVID. And then also just have you lost your job because of COVID-19 COVID-19? I think that, has your job been impacted? Because maybe they didn't lose their job, but maybe they had, maybe they had to pick up a second job or something along those facts, right? Like I feel like depending on what information they're trying to gather, I feel like there's other ways to ask those questions.
Yeah. I'll tell you all my little thing, my pet peeve sometimes, is, I guess Yashna talked about this earlier, but I think some people joined late, is sort of like some of the language around services makes total sense to like people who work in the program. But if I'm not familiar with your programming, I don't know what individualized success coaching necessarily is. Or like mental health resources, like is that counseling? Like some of these things, some of these are sort of, actually, I think job placement assistance is better than employment opportunities because it's a little too vague. I think that's also some other thing with language is it's sort of like, it's lacking a little bit of specificity for someone who's not familiar with program offerings or program services. Like supportive online group discussion groups about what?
Well, I was also going to say, like, if they were to take the additional services and break them out a bit more, because like if I think you had said this was for unhoused individuals, self-care strategies is probably not high on my list if I am unhoused. Like, it may be, resources for housing stability, support, or employment support services, or like you said, health and wellness support services, and being able to break that out more to sort of give categorization. Because again, this is a lot. And above and beyond folks maybe not necessarily understanding the lingo, if they were at least to categorize it, they might be able to pick up a bit more on context clues to better understand what it might mean.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on this? Things you would change? Things you'd remove even?
I mean, are we also judging on aesthetically? Like,
Yeah, go for it.
it just is not like, like sometimes there are things that could just be more pleasant to look at, where maybe it seems briefer, or I don't know. I just feel like aesthetically it looks like homework as opposed to I can check yes or no. Those questions feel like, even if just changing the look of it, a good Canva upgrade or something.
Yeah.
Just to give it, some zhuzh that makes it just a little bit less homeworky looking and more kind of like I can just answer some yes and no questions, and that's helpful. So I just think aesthetically, I'm looking at it and feeling like it could be a little bit more colorful, cheerful, bright, something that makes it seem like it's a friendly, easy to complete survey.
Yeah. And it could make the action really clear, right? Like if it's really clear how I act on these questions, then it's quicker, it's easier, I'm more likely to do it. Which is a visual thing. Like it's not clear how to even say yes here. I will also say something that you might sometimes think to consider is people will game surveys if they don't want to spend time on it. Like this question, do you have access to a computer? If I said yes, and then I was asked this, I was like, I don't want to answer that. And if I was required to answer that question, some people will actually go back and switch their answer to no because they don't want to answer the subsequent one. So sometimes you want to think about like, I'm going to make this one required because I really want to know that. This one I might make optional because if nothing else, I want to know the yes or no question. And then if they drop off, if they don't want to answer this one, like fine, I won't take that information. But yes, in addition to just like making it look nicer and easier to answer, making things optional so people won't game it to get out of it faster can also help you get responses. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing and hand it back over to Yashna. You're
I
muted.
think you're muted.
Question for you
Yeah.
on that in terms of gaming. Do you think that incentives sometimes backfire? Just folks go through and just click whatever so that they can potentially be entered to receive whatever incentive is offered.
Yeah. I think it's like probably more likely to happen, like as Vivien was mentioning, like if it's people who don't already have a relationship with you. I've found that like when it's clients who are already using your services, there's always kind of like this like desire to help or like to like impact the services they're already using and whatnot. So I feel like in these cases, there's in my like experience been very genuine interest in participating. If you're using like maybe like survey platforms online, probably like it's more likely that you're going to have participants who are trying to game it. I know some of the survey platforms have like flags for like if somebody's going for a survey too fast, for example. Like they will kind of like look at like what based on like all the responses they're getting, what is the average time that it takes to kind of like take the survey. And you can also kind of provide your own estimate, and they will flag responses that are kind of like outside of that range. And I think some of them actually like there might be repercussions for respondents if they're found to be gaming a lot. So I feel like this can be something that like does counter it. But I guess like you will always have some people, like my experience has been it's not the majority of folks like usually who are trying to game.
Yeah, I've often seen in the context of like, because one of the things Yashna is talking about these sort of like services that do surveys is like when you're serving a large swath of people who are not your clients or who are not your potential clients, those programs can like do that sort of checking for you. When it's nonprofits giving surveys out to their clients or potential clients, often the gaming actually comes up when the survey is treated like a gate to the thing the person actually wants. Like, I really need to talk to someone right now, and I'm being asked to fill out this thing. They're not necessarily doing it. People aren't generally doing things like to be like, I don't know, to mess up your system. It's more that they're like, it's in the way of the thing that they really need right now. And so they're trying to get through it quickly. And if there's barriers that make it difficult for that, they might change their answers because they need to get to the thing they need. So that's the gaming I just described is often more around like when the survey or the intake form or whatever is like this big gate to even accessing what you need. Whereas if that intake form, for example, and sometimes you can address that by integrating that survey or form into the service itself so that it feels like, okay, I'm here with the person I needed to talk to and I'm answering their questions and they're adding it to they're adding the responses. But it feels like a beginning of something as opposed to a gate to get into the thing that I need. Generally around paying people, there's like, this is maybe a little nerdier than you were hoping for. There is some research. There's like a group of people, economists that say that like if you pay someone for something they would have done anyway, they'll like lose their intrinsic motivation. I personally disagree with that and what I've seen in our work. Like people appreciate when you like pay them for their time. And even if you can't, they will still do it. So I don't know that there's like this sort of like button that goes off if you pay someone for something, they suddenly never want to do it again unless they're paid. People will do things they never planned to do if you pay them. But if they're already open to doing it and you offer them money, like they might be a little more likely to do it, but they would have done it. So I don't know if this is where you were going, but I wouldn't worry about like, oh, if I pay them for this, they'll never want to help us again. And I don't think the paying will make people more likely to game it necessarily, at least in the like client context of like, they're your client and because we're only paying them like, it's not a large amount of money.
Any other questions before we quickly touch on how the team at Ideas 42 updated the survey, and then we'll go into a little break. All right, so let me just like quickly go through over how we updated the survey. I think all of you like brought up really important and good points, and I think we like actually like updated them in more ways than I will be touching on right now. But basically, like first, like we, as many of you mentioned, we made sure that we were providing context on why we're asking questions and what the information will be used for. And then we also made sure that like the questions were organized a bit better. So we had like 3 distinct sections on service preferences, where all questions gave respondents checkboxes to check off. And then we had 1 section that was only focused on contact information and preferences. And at the top of each of these sections, we had like 1 short line that basically described why we were asking these questions as well. And then you will have noticed that most questions were single or multiple choice, and that kind of like we felt like it was limiting responses to the services that the organization is able to offer, or like, but it was making it easier for respondents to fill out the survey. So to kind of like balance this, we ended up including at the very end an open-ended question to be able to like offer an opportunity for clients to add any additional thoughts they had or contribute some nuance to the answers they had already shared. All right. Okay. So, before we move into our last section on dissemination, I want to just share a quick tip about Survey Logic, which is a useful tool if you're using an online survey or reading out a survey to someone. So Survey Logic allows you to ask some people custom questions based on the information they share. It also allows you to end the survey for people who are not your target audience, and helps reduce drop-off because it reduces the number of questions any one person is asked at any point in time. So here's an example of how we use Survey Logic in one of our projects, where we were trying to understand people's experiences in an application process. So the first question we asked clients was to select an answer that best describes them based on where they are within the application process. So if they had filled out an application but had not attended an info session yet, we wanted to ask about the application process. If they had only attended an info session, we wanted to ask these people about the application and the info session. And if they withdrew from the application process, we wanted to learn more about what led these people to withdraw. So we use Survey Logic so that for those who said that they filled out an application but had not attended an info session yet, the second question that they were asked was whether they were planning to attend an information session in the future. For those who had only attended an info session, the second question they were asked was whether they had attended the info session in person. And then for those who withdrew from the application process, the second question that they were asked was how far did they get in the application process before withdrawing? So generally, it's a useful tool for being able to just ask people specific questions depending on their responses and the situation that they're in. All right, so now we've talked a lot about designing surveys. Let's spend a bit of time talking about dissemination, where we'll touch on how you're getting your survey in front of respondents and how you're encouraging them to fill them out. So in this section, we'll discuss how to choose your survey channel, And when we talk about channel, we're referring to where your survey will live. So for example, will it be an online survey or will it be a paper survey? We'll touch on deciding how you're going to administer the survey. So will it be in person or will it be remote, for instance? We'll also talk about deciding how you're going to recruit people, how to put mechanisms in place to ensure successful data collection, little things data collection logistics that you'll want to think about as you're finalizing the process, and then how to set goals and track your progress, adjusting as needed. So there are a number of pros and cons to each channel, and here we wanted to share some non-exhaustive considerations for two common survey channels, the online survey and the paper survey. So for the online survey, there are a number of pros. First, it's easier to see the results. Completion is automatic and easy to track. It allows for survey logic to easily be implemented into your survey. And there's also more flexible distribution channels. So for example, you can do an email blast, you can send it via text message, or you can like have a QR code that you stick on a flyer in places that you know the respondents will be using frequently. In terms of cons, it requires a connection to the internet, which can be something that is not so inclusive, right? So as you're thinking about ways of making surveys more inclusive, depending on the communities that you're working with, this is something that might be an important thing to consider. And then if people can lose the link, if you're just doing email blasts, text message blasts and whatnot, it can get lost in the midst of all the communication that are inbound for clients. So for the paper survey, in terms of pros, it's especially helpful for folks who are not comfortable with online tools, and you also do not have to worry about any kind of like tech glitches happening. And in terms of cons, it is harder to analyze the results if oftentimes you need to kind of like transcribe the results from like paper surveys to a digital method before you're able to analyze it. It is harder to include survey logic. You could potentially say like on paper, if you respond like, XYZ, like then skip to whichever other section, but you cannot really have control over where the clients will fully understand that and like actually do it. It can get lost if it's mailed, and it can be hard to store as well. You need to think about having to like print all the paper surveys. And then if you are kind of like sending it out to people, you'll also need to think about like clients having to return it to you and have to like make that as easy of a process as possible. So sometimes your choice of channel might happen automatically based on your requirements. So for example, if you need logic in your survey, a paper survey might just not work as well, and you might just automatically find yourself choosing an online survey. You'll also want to decide how you will administer the survey, and one dimension to consider is whether this will be done remotely or in person. So thinking through the online and paper survey, once again, you will see that they can both be administered remotely or in person. So for the online survey, if you want to do it remotely, you can share the link via text, email, or flyer. And if you want to do it in person, you can allow respondents to fill out the survey on a digital device, or you can ask respondents questions and record the answers yourself in the online survey. For the paper survey, you can mail the print survey and make it as easy as possible for respondents to mail their responses back in. And then if you want to do it in person, you can provide respondents with a copy of the survey to fill out in person, obviously. And then similar to what we said for the online survey, you can also ask respondents questions in person and just record the answers yourself in the paper survey. So some questions to consider as you decide how you want to administer your survey are like what your relationship is with your respondents, how often, if at all, do you interact with them, how have you communicated and interacted with your target audience in the past, and what has worked well. So you'll really want to basically pause and think about like systems that are already in place or knowledge that you already have on like what works with your target audience. Once you decide how you're going to administer your survey, you'll also want to determine your recruitment needs and channels. For instance, will you recruit clients via an email blast, via a text message campaign, through flyers, or maybe like through incoming client calls? It is important to note that client recruitment and survey dissemination can sometimes overlap. So for example, if you're doing an email blast to clients and the email includes recruitment content already, then you don't really have to kind of like think of them as separate things. Next, you will want to have some talking points or language for describing your survey to clients that you want to recruit. So we'd suggest starting with many of the same questions that we suggested for the survey introduction. So you want to maybe touch on why should respondents complete the survey, how long it will take, when should they complete it by, what will you do with information, who will have access to it, is the survey anonymous, what is the compensation like, if any. And depending on how you're describing the survey to people, you might use these talking points to describe it verbally or in a written format. But no matter what channel you're using, you'll want to touch on these important pieces of information. And as you work on building out your talking points, you can reference our communications checklist, which Hiba will share in the chat. So a key insight about human behavior that you want to keep in mind as you're planning your dissemination and actually doing that work is that people have limited attention, which means we can really only focus on a few things at once. And this is really why we are so prone as human beings to getting distracted or forgetting things. So when you're planning your dissemination, you want to assume that people are going to forget to complete your survey or may start completing the survey at any point in time and get distracted partway through. As a result, you'll want to plan to send reminders to people. This is also a reason to shorten your surveys, and the shorter survey is, the less likely someone is to get distracted partway through. Another feature of limited attention is that we don't notice what we don't expect. So if respondents are not expecting a survey from you, they might not be looking for it in mail or will be more likely to treat it as junk mail, or they might just notice it in their inboxes. So if it's possible, it's useful to let people know ahead of time that a survey is coming their way so that they can keep an eye out for it. We'd recommend making a few additional decisions as you finalize your data collection logistics, and here we have outlined some non-exhaustive considerations. So if respondents are filling out the survey on their own, you might want to think about when you will start distributing the survey, when you will stop collecting responses, when you will remind respondents, about the survey, when you will remind respondents to complete the survey, or like if they've dropped off, for example. If you're filling out the survey for or with respondents, you will want to think about when you will start or stop recruitment, when you will start and stop collecting responses, and how often and at what times you will collect more responses. Last but not least, this plan should be flexible. If you hit your goal early, you can reduce how much outreach you're doing. And if you're behind, you might want to send more reminders or increase how often you're going out to collect responses, or sometimes even think about increasing compensation. But either way, it's a good thing to have a plan in place to make sure that you're keeping track throughout and are adjusting as need be. And as you're making these decisions, you'll want to leverage your experience with your target audience to make all of them. So what do you know about their day-to-day? Are there times of a day or days of a week when folks are more likely to be on their phones or free to answer some questions? Perhaps are there times of a year even when people have more free time? And the second thing you'll want to think about is how to incorporate your survey into existing touch points or interactions. So you can think about whether maybe there's a community meeting that might be a good time to let people know about the upcoming survey or to launch it, or to even start collecting responses, for instance. And finally, you'll want to make sure that you have a dissemination plan. You want to set a response goal based on criteria such as your needs and how many responses you've gotten in the past, if you have sent out similar surveys in the past. And you'll want to set a check-in schedule for yourself or your team to make sure that you're making progress towards your goal. And third, you'll want to set a schedule to check if you need to make adjustments in your survey collection, compensation, and reminders. Any questions on anything that we covered so far?
Yashna, I have a question. For longer surveys, sometimes there's the option for respondents to save and come back to the survey. In your work, is that an effective strategy to like increase the response rate, giving folks an option if you can't get around having a longer survey?
Yeah. I wonder. I've actually not had experience with that. Vivien, I don't know if you do.
So you need a clear point of contact with the person. or quite a bit of incentive. I've done that. So the one time I did that was with some housing nonprofits, and they opted to do it basically. This was their main challenge, was that people could not spend much time on anything. I don't exactly remember why, but that was their challenge with surveys, was they needed quite a bit of information, and none of their clients could spend that amount of time. And so we opted to have the surveys run on a phone call. And the idea, and that was some of the questions we showed you is from that survey, where it was like the client is open to answering more. That was the staff facing sort of like survey. And the idea was at any point in time in the survey, the staff could click like client is no longer, like, has to jump off. And then the survey would save, and then the staff would call back, would be like, okay, yeah, you can totally hop off. Like, when can I call back and we can finish this off? They had mixed success. Like, if they could access the person again, they would finish filling it out. But there was always that if. So I think you sort of like need a clear connection where like the person's going to come back for another session. And so like they're going to be there anyway, and it's easy to sort of bring them back into the survey. Or there needs to be some sort of benefit to them that's not just completing the survey. So let's say I need to fill out something so that I can be grouped with like a good set of, with like the right financial counselor, whatever, right? Like they have if you have a bunch of financial counselors who have areas of expertise, and we need you to fill out the survey so we can match you. If I don't finish the survey, I'm actually not accessing the thing I want. So then I might like keep coming back, but it is challenging to get people to come back to something once they've dropped off. But if that's the case, yes, something that saves itself is ideal. It's a very good feature to use.
It's very helpful. Thank you.
All right.
I had a question. Sorry.
Yes.
I had a question about setting targets for response rates. So like if you have we're at affordable housing and have a portfolio of 464 households, and we've always kind of like debated, had conversations around what we would feel like is a viable response rate to say that it's a good representation of the community.
Yeah. That's always a tough one.
Who are you talking? Like this question kind of depends on who the audience is. Like, because if you're talking to like academics or you want to publish, what a representative group is like a different.
It's more about informing. It's more about informing services. So that if we want to get it, because we want to feel like the services that we're providing, if we're assessing for needs, and we're also determining like what kind of programming we want to make. We want to be able to feel like we can say it's resident-centric, person-centric, and resident voice. So you don't want to feel like we have these great ideas about what we think people need, but haven't really made sure that that's what the residents want and need. But then how much do you let that be determined by what the sample size is? Like, what's a significant enough sample size to say, hey, I think we have a good pulse on what the residents want to see our department provide?
I think that's like a challenge that we also like face within our work, where we oftentimes will like talk to clients and like get their feedback, on like designs that we're trying to kind of like help our partners adopt. And like the way that at least like I think about it is that it's always better to have like a certain amount of like client feedback rather than nothing, right? And like I think like if you have the ability to think about like, or like you have a data maybe on like a certain demographic of clients that are struggling the most, or like where you have like a bit more specificity that would allow you to kind of like narrow down on the kind of clients that you really want to make sure that you're interviewing and you're getting feedback on, or there are like some like big differences in how like maybe across like different age groups like people like feel about your services. Maybe you want to like make sure that you have like representation along those lines. I think like that can be like a helpful way to think about making it representative. It's never going to be representative across like every single dimension, but maybe like trying to think about like what are the dimensions that really like based on the data that you already have on your programs would be helpful to like gather feedback on. Like that could be like a way of getting around it.
Yeah, that's I think where I would go is what are the different groups of people that you think have unique experience, like unique from each other experiences? So like if you're thinking about a household, like a single person versus a family, those people like housing is just very different for those two groups. I'm sort of like hypothesizing, but I suspect just like based on your staff, the staff could probably talk about like, oh yeah, these sort of like young women tend to have sort of like a different set of experiences than older women, right? Like, and so thinking about who do we think has unique experiences and then trying to get some respondents in each of those buckets. We also, what we'll do is, this is sort of like the technical term, but we look for saturation a lot of times, which is basically like people start to just answer the same, like you start to get the same responses from enough people that you're realizing that like either you're just targeting one group and they all share exactly the same identity and like the same experiences. But if you're trying to get people from different groups and you're starting to reach a point where everybody's kind of sending you in one direction, that's the point at which you can sort of like, okay, we're good. Like we've reached saturation. We've started to get similar themes coming up. People are either saying A, B, or C in most responses. Then you sort of like can assume that you have a good enough group and then move forward. Obviously, this isn't a science. Doing things that are sort of like client informed, especially with clients and folks who are busy, like we can't force people to participate and we can't, but also you want to make the services as good as you can. And so sometimes it's a matter of treating it as an ongoing learning and just having something to start with.
So I guess it's not necessarily looking at it as like a percentage gives you a certain amount of validity.
If you were talking to academics, yes. A lot of our, like we talk to academics a lot, so like we have to like negotiate with them. But in our like project work where we're thinking about like we're thinking about balancing reality of like accessing people and needing to make improvements to programs in like a sort of efficient, effective way. It often ends up being about looking at like, are we getting a good group of people? Are we seeing similar responses from them? And do we feel like this is giving us enough direction that like we can try it and then see what people respond or how people respond? So no, there's not really you could come up with a percentage using like academic procedure, like academic thinking, but it ends up being overkill for program design, I think.
Like I think like you don't want like maybe like one person to inform your program design, of course, but like there's like a middle ground there. And I think like it's always better if you can like talk to 10 clients, even like 10 of your clients, like to get feedback than like just designing things without any inputs, right, from like anyone. So that's like my point of view on that.
So I'll just give you for example, we have 464 households and we got 100 households to respond. And there was debate of like, is that enough households to direct services? And I'm like, well, we're doing surveys, but we're not like, this is not our field of expertise. We're like social workers trying to get feedback on informing services. So when it's not in your field, I think it's hard to know, like, is this enough to inform services going forward? Is like, I guess that's the part when it's not your field of expertise. It's hard to know how much feels like it's a robust enough feedback.
Honestly, that's a pretty good number. Like you got a fourth of your residents to respond. I would like if you collected like some sort of demographic information from folks, I would look back and see, is it all the same kind of like groups of people, like the same sort of like type of resident responding, or do you have a mix? And if you have a mix and you're seeing like some patterns, I think that should be enough to start. You may want to pair it with like talking to people even informally. So like, let's say you got a lot of responses, but I don't know, there's one type of household where you're like, we got 2 people in this group, like maybe they're in a building, like maybe you have, I don't know how many buildings you have, but there's a building that's a little further out and you only got 2 responses in that building. Maybe you have someone go up there and like chat with people a little bit just to like pressure test the direction you got. And so then you can sort of fill in the findings from the survey and check like, yeah, okay, they're sort of agreeing with what we heard. And so let's move forward. I would say a fourth of your population is pretty good. So
Thank you.
Any other questions before we dive into just maybe sharing out some dissemination strategies that have worked for us in the past, or maybe any upcoming survey where you're starting to think about dissemination strategies? All right. Well, if anyone wants to share dissemination strategies, please feel free to unmute and let us know. Or if you even just want to like discuss any kind of like survey that you have upcoming, we're happy to chat with you about that.
So I do have a question. We completed the survey, the one I described, where we got that amount of respondents. And before we revisit, it took us so much time being non-data people to synthesize the data and kind of figure out what implications we felt like we got from the data. We wanted to kind of give out the information to residents to see, kind of almost treat it as a focus group, that what is their reaction to the data? What is their reaction to the information? Does it resonate with them? And maybe get some more feedback on it before starting a new survey. But that's just kind of our guessing about next steps, because I think we got the data, we got the information, but I think we're kind of like, well, what are next steps to follow up with that? Because there are some takeaways we can inform services, but it's taken us so long to kind of get all of these pieces worked out that it's almost time to do the survey again for it to be an annual survey. So I feel like sometimes you're in spaces of doing things that are really good exercises to do, but don't necessarily have the like step by step of, well, what do you do with the data? How do you inform the people who completed it about the results so that they feel like they saw what we did with the data, that it wasn't just a survey that goes into outer space and they never know what came of it. So we felt like we wanted to kind of, invite residents, if they were interested in seeing what our results were, and then engage them in what the process is going to be going forward and how we hope to use the information. And then come March, it'll be time to do it again. So just on that, like based on that sequencing, do you have any suggestions on kind of like how to follow up with getting surveys? It's not just getting them, but what do you do with the information and make it show that there's a value add for the residents to keep participating in something like that?
I really love that you're bringing back the results to the residents. That's something that at Ideas 42 even like we talk about quite often, like how we can make sure that like as we are getting information from respondents, it's not just kind of like a one-way street and it doesn't feel just kind of like extractive, but like people feel like they can also like, be fully participating in the process up till the very end and know what their time and efforts went towards. So I think it's a really, really good idea to bring like your survey results back to your respondents. And like, in addition to just kind of like being like a wonderful thing to do, like in like building the relationship, I think like if there are any kind of like actionable like points that you can bring up, like of like, okay, you responded this and like this is kind of like what we're doing with this information and what it will impact. I feel like that's like even better, because I think like once you tell people that all these responses are not just going into like a big void and like nothing's being done with it, that can build like an even better relationship and more motivation almost to kind of like keep responding to your survey. So I feel like that's like a really, really great practice to have there.
yeah, and like you were phrasing it as like, man, the next survey is almost here and we haven't even done it, but it's actually really good timing to be like, hey, last time you filled this out, here's the things that happened. We're asking you to fill it out again. And even in the survey, you can add questions like, hey, last time people said they were interested in X, Y, and Z. Are you? Obviously, if you get different people, maybe you'll get a disagreement. And I think it might, you probably, it's very unlikely you'll have gotten in one survey people interested in something, and then the next survey, nobody interested in it. But you could integrate it into the survey even and get additional feedback around like, hey, we heard people really want like, I don't know, local childcare. We are planning to like work with some like 2 or 3 folks who have home-based childcare in the 5-block radius within these times. Like, are those times worth it? Like, are those times the times you even need childcare? You could use the next survey to like improve even the design of what you're doing and like the details. Man, I was gonna say, oh, another, so that's around like following up with folks. I think if you're like feeling like you're not sure what to do with the data coming out of the survey responses, as you're designing this next one, I would take the fact that you're not sure what to do with the data as actually like a problem with the survey, not a problem with you guys not knowing what to do with it. It might be that you asked a question that people didn't answer in the way you expected. And so like, you don't know what to do with it, not because you didn't know what you wanted, but because people just answered it in a way that wasn't as helpful as you were hoping. And so that tells you like, maybe we remove this question. It didn't give us anything we needed. Like it wasn't that helpful in the end. Or like, people misunderstood this. We need to rewrite it. So I would like, I think take the fact that you're feeling like stuck with what to do with the data as like, something's wrong with the survey and there's a way to improve it and get more data that you could use, or you can just cut some questions because you realized like, you know what, if people tell us they need childcare, we can't do anything about that. So like, why are we like, we're not going to ask it next time.
Not super helpful. Thank you.
And I would also say that like if you, as you're having these conversations where you're presenting the last survey results to clients, like to your respondents, that might be like a really nice time to also, you know, like get more feedback or like more nuance on like what their responses were. And like just these conversations, because sometimes, especially if you're doing like yes, no questions and whatnot, like you understand what the preferences is, but you could like dive a bit deeper. So you could almost like use it as an opportunity to like get more perspective on like the responses that you got in the past, and also like figure out if there are like maybe like more areas to be explored, and that could like even inform your next survey, right? Like if like through these conversations you're learning that, oh, maybe we need to like investigate this like one specific area a little bit more, and there's like less clarity that like, and it would help to have more clarity in that specific area to like inform our designs. You could just kind of like choose to adapt your next survey to fill these gaps. I hope this is helpful. Anything else that anyone wants to discuss? All right. If not, then we can not dive in, like we can just wrap up, I suppose. So this is it for me. Like, and Vivien, I guess I wanted to say thank you all so much for being here. I hope you enjoyed the workshop and learned something along the way. If you could please scan this code using your phone and fill out our feedback survey, we would really greatly appreciate it. And if you enjoyed this workshop, you might also enjoy our burnout workshop that we'll be hosting on January 13th. So Hiba will share the registration link in the chat right now, and you can also keep an eye out for registration information that will be coming to you via email in January. So I will now hand it over to Hiba to wrap it up for us.
Thank you so much, Yashna and Vivien, for your expertise. And thank you all of you for taking the time to join. I know this time of the year is especially tricky with everything going on at the end of the year. So we appreciate you making time for this discussion. Please note that the registration for our remaining immersion sessions, this is our last one of the year, but we have several more that are going to be happening, including another one by Ideas 42 in the new year. So please look at our website. We've dropped the link in the chat for the one that Ideas 42 will be leading that Yashna just mentioned. And the recording from this session will also be up on our resource hub probably in a couple of days. So be patient about that. And once it is up, we'll send you all a link to it as well if you want to share it with your colleagues and partners. And with that, we wish you a very safe and restful holiday season. If you have any questions or need anything else from the EVC team, you know how to reach us. And we hope you have a lovely rest of the day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.